This is the agenda. We'll go over research considerations relating to criminality or delinquency as a high risk factor, understanding desistance from problem behaviors, the DPR model of desistance, and applying the model for coaching clients. The content today is pulled from the criminal desistance research. It's my specialization within forensic psychology. So every class in this course shares content pulled directly from the research literature on the topics we're discussing. The cool thing about today is I'll be sharing highlights from my own formal research study and highlights of the literature review that was the basis for my dissertation. This content is very close to my heart because I am a representative of this audience. I was this high-risk kid. Many of my family members and friends are representatives of this audience. Some of us made it out and some didn't. That is absolutely why YCI is here, though, to equip more like you and I to help more struggling in this place of trying to make better decisions, helping them to make it out and find a path forward pro-socially. So recall when you learned about risks, needs, and protective factors. You would have learned high risk refers to presence of multiple serious risk factors with few protective factors to mitigate the negative outcomes. Adolescents involved in delinquency or criminality are at a greater risk of health or life compromising outcomes, so incarceration, unemployability, or school failure. Criminogenic and non-criminogenic needs are examples of risk factors. The major difference between these is that criminogenic needs are risk factors that have been identified by research to have direct links to criminal behavior, and non-criminogenic needs are risk factors that do not show any evidence-based correlation to criminal behavior. Don Andrews and James Bonta have researched criminal behavior for decades and developed the risk needs responsivity model that shows to be the most effective among juvenile treatment interventions. This is relevant to any of you with interest in working with youth who've been in contact with the police or the court system in some way for offending. Andrews and Bonta identified 7 risk factors directly linked to offending behavior. So these are evidence-based risk factors relevant to youth who have already become engaged in risk behavior. They need to be addressed for effective interventions, so knowing what they are is key. The first 3 are the most important because they found interventions targeting those first 3 show the greatest reductions in recidivism or refraining from reoffending. These 3 are pro-social criminal attitudes, that's rationalizing crime and negative attitudes toward law, and social supports for crime, that's having criminal friends and lacking access to positive social influences. Then antisocial personality patterns, that's a combination of impulsivity, being self-centered, and emotionally callous. Emotionally callous is the primary distinction in this one. The other 4 are poor school or work performance, lacking motivation or satisfaction in these areas, substance abuse, negative family or marital relationships, and lack of involvement in positive social leisure activities. Some examples of non-criminogenic needs are anxiety, depression, serious mental health disorders, low self-esteem, poor self-worth, and physical health. This line of research has found interventions for youth who have already become involved in risk behavior must address both criminogenic and non-criminogenic needs to be effective with reducing problem behaviors. Those that focus solely on non-criminogenic needs are insufficient, but those that focus on non-criminogenic needs are necessary to help address motivational aspects of behavior change. And on to desistance. When I use the term criminal desistance, I get a lot of blank stares. It's not a common term. Most have never heard of it until I have the conversation with them. So here's your explanation. Desistance is to cease, stop, or abstain from something. Criminal desistance refers to the transition from offending to non-offending. Desistance researchers investigate why offenders stop offending, in contrast to recidivism researchers who investigate why offenders reoffend. So desistance researchers are exploring the issue from a what went right perspective versus that what went wrong perspective. Recidivism research is applied to prevention efforts. Desistance research is applied to encourage and support the desistance process to enhance the likelihood of success. The focus is criminal offenders who are ready to change, those who are ready to find a way to live a pro-social life. Criminal behavior is defined in several ways, but here are the most common to the criminology discipline. Criminal behavior is defined by these four domains. Legal, which is your actions prohibited by law and punishable by state or government. Moral, your actions considered to violate norms of religion and morality believed to be punishable by supreme spiritual beings. Social, actions that violate the norms of customs or traditions of a society and are punishable by community. And psychological, actions that inflict pain or loss on others. Why support desistance though? Because criminality is a problem behavior, and problem behavior is a result before a cause. Any number of biological, psychological, social, or political economic contributors may influence criminal behavior. Many of those are beyond the individual's control at the time problem behavior begins. So examples are your risk factors like abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, or adverse environments. And criminality most often begins during adolescence and young adulthood, that developmentally vulnerable life stage that we now know so much about. This is one of the many reasons why coaching to support teens and young adults is so crucial. This is the age crime curve. It's one of the most consistent and widely known findings in criminology research. The curve refers to that peak and curve you see in the data that shows criminal behavior tends to increase through adolescence, peak in late adolescence through young adulthood, and progressively decrease thereafter. This curve repeats itself year after year in crime reports. Leading criminologists Robert Sampson and John Lobb have conducted some of the most famous longitudinal studies on life course criminality and found even the most active and serious offenders eventually progress through desistance at some point during middle adulthood. So aging out of crime is the norm for all offenders, regardless of how serious their offenses were. And continuing to address the question, why support desistance? Let's discuss some of the statistics. When we think about crime and criminals, we have the commercialized idea of murderers, rapists, and other violent criminals. Realistically, though, criminal behavior is most often nonviolent. According to the FBI's 2015 Uniform Crime Report, which is the most updated version, 80% of arrests in the US were for nonviolent offenses. 30% of those were for illegal substances or drug-related. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons' May 2017 offense statistics, 84.3% of offenses were nonviolent. 46.3% of those were drug offenses. And between 1980 to 2007, the U.S. correctional population increased by 386% due to the tough on crime era and related minimum sentencing laws. And unfortunately, those laws have not affected us all equally. Racial disparities in minority contact with the law have resulted in disproportionate minority representation in jails and prisons. In 2013, African Americans represented 59% of the U.S. federal and state prison population, while only representing 13% of the U.S. population the same year. Minority youth and Black youth in particular remain more likely to be incarcerated and serve longer sentences than their white peers for the same crimes. In 2013, 40% of juveniles detained in residential placement were Black, 32% were white, and 23% were Hispanic. Yet white youth comprised 74% of the U.S. population of juveniles the same year, while Blacks comprised only 15%. Collateral consequences of criminal convictions create very real oppressive barriers to positive reform. And when you consider the injustice that is typically happening in that processing people in the system, this long-term negative repercussion that they deal with is absolutely infuriating. These widespread barriers perpetuate a cycle of criminality and poverty in many of the nation's poorest communities. Individuals with criminal convictions face barriers to gainful employment in sectors involving living wages. Limitations to financial aid that would limit their access to the education that could be that primary resource to leverage to climb out of their circumstances. They face limitations to welfare and housing benefits and plenty other sanctions and restrictions across jurisdictions. Those are barriers to the most basic survival needs: housing, education, and employment. And when you consider that most of those crimes are committed during a developmental age when young people are naturally more prone to risk behavior, many are simply doing what they know and living what they see. And most of those crimes are nonviolent. It is absolutely clear to me that this is an audience where we can make a powerful difference with these skills we're developing here, these skills to support young people to overcome and thrive. Now let's review some findings of desistance research to understand the process. How do people involved in offending behavior transition away from it? Desistance research has been in process for around 30 years now. Most of that research has focused on understanding the desistance process directly from those who've experienced it. Through those studies, desistance researchers have found these factors contribute to successful desistance. And as I go through these, I want you to put your coaching hat on and think of ways coaching can help facilitate and support these processes. The individual experiences discontentment with the present self, recognizes a potential feared future self, and is able to envision a desired replacement self. The individual has a personal interest and desire to change. They have a sense of agency, a sense of ownership to choose and act on their own behalf. They make an intentional decision to change. They have clear future goals and develop plans and strategies to achieve those goals. They have a sense of self-efficacy or confidence in their ability to implement those strategies and achieve those goals. They engage in active behavior modification and goal pursuit. In doing so, they attend to distancing themselves from contexts and relationships that would interfere with desistance goals. They create new identities associated with new roles they're pursuing, and eventually achieve a place of no longer identifying with the criminal self. That identity change component within the desistance process was the focus of my study. I conducted a study of a group of long-term desisters, those who were 10 years post-desistance. So on the other side of 10 years after their positive reform. I did this study to understand the determinants, which were what factors led to that successful identity change from offender to non-offender, and what behaviors supported that change. I found the determinants or prerequisites were a self-determined commitment to pursue a non-offending working identity and a sense of agency to pursue the non-offending working identity. The behaviors were: the desister begins refining his or her internal and external world to fit the non-offending working identity. They prioritize self-regulation and self-development. They identify and pursue accessible structural supports conducive to non-offending, most often school, work, pro-social family, friends, or groups. They alter social capital toward connections in line with the non-offending identity and away from connections who would otherwise threaten the non-offending identity's development, and remain actively engaged in chosen pro-social environments, leveraging those to guide behavior modification to develop the non-offending identity. This is a snapshot of the model I created based on the research. It's in your resource packet. You can refer back to that as a quick hit reminder of the elements important to address with these clients if you were to work with them. And then one of the most important things to understand when considering supporting someone through identity change is that it's possible to change the working identity engaged in offending behavior while remaining who one is. Many think of identity change as a complete overhaul, like they have to change who they are completely. And that's just not the case. You likely discussed this before at some point in your training when you learned about self concept and developing your coaching identity. But identity change is a major aspect of the criminal desistance process. So we're going over it again here. Remember, identities capture the sense of self or self concept as we relate to others and social roles. That self concept houses the traits, behaviors, and attitudes we use to engage with that role, relationship, or context. These figures on the screen give you an example of how identity change can involve much smaller shifts and tweaks to the traits, behaviors, or attitudes no longer conducive to our goals. So here you have this person who has an identity as a son or daughter to parents with strong bonds. That related sense of self is loving, helpful, and has a positive attitude toward family. This person has an identity as a football player with a related sense of self that's dedicated, a team player, a strong, valuable asset to the team, and has a positive attitude toward football. They have an identity as a student with a related sense of self that has difficulty learning, is disengaged in school, not motivated, and has a negative attitude toward school. They also have an identity as a friend with a related sense of self that's fun, daring, deviant, and has a negative attitude toward rules. If this is a would-be desister who's motivated and committed to change, they may run through this identity assessment and determine which aspects of the working identity may need to change to support their desistance goals. They may realize the engagement and motivation issues in school and the attitude toward school should be addressed, as should the deviance and negative attitude toward rules. So their desistance work may include addressing motivation and engagement and shifting their attitude toward school, and work on compliance and shifting their attitude toward rules. And time to discuss how we might support clients processing through desistance. We'll touch on each of the factors of desistance found in the research and consider ways we might focus coaching efforts to support that leg of the process. And side note, using this model would be an example of coaching a client through a coaching program. So you could use the model to coach them in the areas where they need work. And these slides will give you focus areas for each desistance factor. To address desistance factors relating to self-determined motivation, those were discontentment with the present self, a feared future self, and desired replacement self, and a personal interest and desire to change. We can spend time coaching around awareness of what is or what might become, helping the client to do some visioning around what could be. We could focus on meaning and purpose, developing the why that matters to the client. To address desistance factors relating to empowerment and commitment, those were that sense of agency or power to choose and act and an intentional decision to change. We could focus coaching efforts around helping the client understand choice points, have the client consider ways they contributed to their own outcomes, that ownership and accountability stuff, help them identify past successes or build confidence. To address desistance factors relevant to goal setting and strategy, having clear future goals, plans, and strategies to achieve those goals, and a sense of self-efficacy to implement those strategies and achieve those goals. We could focus our coaching efforts around helping the client identify strengths and resources they may leverage for change, and identify practical goals and plan actions to achieve them. To address desistance factors relevant to goal pursuit and achievement, those are active behavior modification and goal pursuit, distancing from contexts and relationships that would interfere with desistance goals, and creating new identities associated with new roles. We could focus coaching efforts around supporting the client as they take action toward goals, identify people and places conducive to goals, support them as they spend more time there and less time with people and places that would interfere with goals. We can bring attention to using insight and outsight to inform self-regulation and self-development. And for any of you interested in desistance coaching or Any of you connected to juvenile or young adult offenders ready to do this work? I published this very simple, quick hit booklet based on the dissertation. It's meant to serve as a very quick guide for positive reform for juvenile and emerging adult offenders to work through on their own if they're not open to reaching out for help. They are encouraged to work through it with a supportive adult, coach, or therapist in their lives, though. It works well as a coaching program framework for coaches to facilitate desistance sessions in individual or group format, and it includes simple overviews of the desistance process and coaching questions tailored to address each of those.